Um, Thank you. So it doesn't look like there's a lot of people here, which is understandable. This third workshop piece is reserved for RFP processes, which is our most um, typically our most complicated, more in-depth process, and that one that we don't use frequently throughout the city for procurement purposes. It is important to take note of, and it is important to kind of do a disambiguation of it, just so people are aware, but I don't anticipate this becoming up more than a dozen times throughout any fiscal year. So for those of you that are interested, I'll try to move quickly through this workshop in this case and leave enough time for questions. And if people want to touch on topics covered in previous sessions, or if there's anything that, may be unclear from past webinars. So to begin with, I want to do a quick refresher. I'll introduce myself. My name is Shu Wang. I'm the Assistant Purchasing Agent for Goods and Services here at the city. And last workshop, we covered the meat and potatoes of what we do for most of our procurements at the city, which is the RFQs and IFBs. RFQs, meaning request for quotes, which is a process that the city follows when typically buying items or services between the $10,000 and $50,000 threshold range. And IFBs, or invitation for bids, which is the process we follow typically for goods and services above $50,000 range. In both cases, it requires the production of a scope of work or product specifications, and the vendor then submits a quote or a bid in writing through our new e-procurement platform. We also talked a little bit about the differences between the two processes, where invitations for bids require a more robust advertising timeline, requires advertising in a few places, and there's typically a longer timeline involved in going through that process. We noted also that the city would choose to use an IFB process instead of the RFQ process for lower price goods or services when we want to solicit from a wider range of vendors and open it up to the public. That just enables us to reach out to a broader pool of product or service providers. And in this session, I hope to cover a little bit about the last kind of public procurement process that the goods and services follow, which is requests for proposals or RFPs, as well as when the city might use this procurement method and how you should respond to an RFP process. And at the end there, we left a little bit of time to just do a brief overview about some of the other procurement processes that the city typically follows when we go out and procure goods and services. They may be of interest to anybody here or following along after the fact. And we can provide a little more detail when we get to that stage. So what is an RFP process? What is a request for proposals? The city conducts the RFP process much like the RFQ and IFB processes. So this is a process that we use to procure goods and services that cost more than $50,000. At its base, it seems very much similar to the IFB process. They are both following the same procurement guidelines in terms of how it's structured, in terms of the advertising deadlines, and in terms of the general publicization of them. The key difference being the RFP process allows us to compare not just price. So where the invitation for bids and the request for quote processes are ultimately governed by the lowest price, meaning that we are typically restricted to award based on price only. Request for proposals is a system by which we can award based on a number of other qualifying criteria. Just like the IFB process, we must publish any RFPs using the newspaper of general circulation. For us, that's Cambridge Chronicle. For other towns, it may be their local newspaper. We must advertise in the city website, the state's procurement portal, the Combuy system. And if it is over $100,000, we post the notices in the state's goods and services bulletin that is published by the Secretary of State. Construction contracts and solicitation appear in the central register, which is in the same place as the goods and services bulletin, but it's ultimately a separate publication just for those of you that are interested. And just like an IFB, an RFP will have those same quality requirements, bid submission requirements, and it'll also have a sample articles of agreement or a contract involved, as well as the scope of services. So those same elements appear once again as an RFP. And I'll delve a little bit into the kind of the differences that separate them and how they typically come up. And please stop me if I'm going too fast or if there's any questions. I'm happy to take a pause if anyone has anything that they'd like to pose. And I see Tyrone has noted if you have a question, feel free to drop it into the chat. We can address it at a pause in the slides as well. So what is a request for proposals, an RFP process? The key thing that makes RFP processes different from all of the other processes we've kind of discussed thus far is that this is a price planning process. There is a separate technical and price proposal section for any submittals that we receive. During the process itself, and you'll see in any RFPs that we put out into the public sphere, there will be strict rules written so that it instructs anyone submitting a proposal to only submit the technical aspects of whatever it is they're offering. For an RFP process that we are getting a good from, let's say some kind of hardware or even software perhaps, or machine, the RFP process will ask you what are the technical specifications of that product. For something that is more service oriented, like a consultant. I think there's a question about a copy of the presentation. I believe this is being recorded, so it will be sent to everyone. So for an RFP process dealing with something like a service, like a consultation agreement, the technical specs might ask you to only submit your history, your past experience, that kind of information, as well as past work product. The price proposal at this section will remain completely sealed until the technical evaluation is done. And that's kind of the key difference between an RFP versus an IFB. The city will then award the contract to the most advantageous proposal, taking consideration of both the proposal's merits as well as the prices, which may result in a contract award that is not necessarily the lowest price. And that's kind of the key thing here. Continue on. The key element then that is different from an IFB in an RFP is the comparative evaluation criteria. So unlike the quality requirements, which are kind of binary yes/no questions that deal with the minimum acceptable standards of what the good or service offers, comparative criteria allows the awarding entity to compare other alternate forms of criteria that are not necessarily price-based. Some examples might include past experience. The city, for example, might deem someone with 10 years of experience to be highly advantageous versus someone who maybe only has 3 years of experience. Or in the example of a software vendor, perhaps their software offer has better UI interfaces, has better interactions with existing modules. And so it allows us to compare all of these different elements that have nothing to do with price, and then ultimately award perhaps to not necessarily the lowest bidder, but the most advantageous proposal. And it's set by statute that the comparative criteria are structured into these categories: the HA, A, NA, and UA. UA is typically an unacceptable element. So if someone doesn't meet that minimum standards, their proposal might be rejected just by having that UA rating, while the HA, A, and NA ratings will be set in the proposal itself, and it'll have very clear definitions of what defines an NA, what defines an A, what defines an HA. These will be all listed out in the proposal itself, so they'll be very clear from anyone looking at the RFP to see what they need to do to achieve each of those categories. quantity. So I see the question about there are not quantitative scores provided, just qualitative. In terms of, are you talking about scoring as of 1, 2, 3, 4? Right. So there are no numerical scorings. This is set by statute that it's going to be HAA, NA, and UA. Other states do this differently. For Massachusetts, the criteria scoring are these four. I hope that answers your question. Perfect. So I'll move on to a little bit of an example. So this is taken directly from the handbook, I believe, for RFP, the Chapter 30B RFPs. This is an example of a comparative evaluation criteria dealing with a golf course procurement. In it, you can see the criterion itself is the experience of managing a golf course. The entity in question is seeking a golf course manager, and they put out an RFP listing out a number of quality requirements and a number of criterions. This is an example of one. You can see that it lays out each of the three acceptable ratings. Highly advantageous is when the proposed superintendent has 5 or more years of experience as a golf course superintendent managing an 18-hole golf course. Advantageous there after that is 3 or more years of experience as a superintendent or 5 or more years of experience as an assistant golf course superintendent or higher. While not advantageous is less than 3 years of experience as a golf course superintendent or less than 5 years of experience as an assistant golf course superintendent level or higher. Do note that not advantageous is not unacceptable. If someone does not meet that NA category rating, their proposal may still be accepted and rated. And in the case of there, being other ratings, other criterion that they're compared by, they may actually still win the award. The NA typically is the lowest acceptable rating that a municipality or a nonprofit entity, whoever is putting the RFP out, will accept. Whereas the unacceptable rating is used when they don't meet the bare minimum. And note that there's only 3 reflected here because the unacceptable is typically laid out in the quality requirements or the scope of services themselves as bidder must have this amount of experience. The plan of services. A plan of services must be evaluated in the same manner as other comparative evaluation criteria in the RFP. It is the plan for providing the goods or service listed in the RFP. For example, a staffing plan for delivering janitorial services, or a consultant that's going to perform a study and their staffing layout, what their report is, for example, or the number of market rate units available in a city. The plan of services would present what steps the consultant would take to collect the data / perform the analysis, whatever it is that is laid out in the scope of services in the RFP itself. This is the element that is allowed to be negotiated after the fact because a lot of the elements typically are not known at the point of solicitation. What is laid out in the scope of services otherwise is non-negotiable, and typically you have to identify those prior to the contract being awarded. Like in an IFB process, no changes can be made to any component of the submittal after the submission deadline. So we can't go in after the fact and negotiate elements of the submission, except for the plan of services. And then the final plan, once finalized, can be incorporated into any contract that results from the RFP process. So that typically, we see that more often in staffing plans, where there is a maybe more fluid staffing plan in terms of a consultant agency sending in a proposal to something that we put out. The members themselves may not yet be known, but they can assign, for example, 2 prime consultants, an office manager, plus any kind of sub-consultants or researchers. But those identities and the timelines themselves may not be fully ironed out at the stage of soliciting the proposals. After the fact, we can negotiate, we can figure out kind of what exactly those members are, as well as the maybe, so let me see, there's an additional question. So isn't the plan of services also referred to as the bidder slash proposer's technical approach? That may be one of the evaluation factors. Yes, absolutely. That can appear as an evaluation criteria if it is laid out in the scope in the RFP itself. We have done several RFPs in the past that have different ratings depending on the clarity and the kind of concreteness of the proposed staffing teams. So for example, there are past consultant RFP processes in which we rate the proposed members of the consultant team and their past experience in doing the subject matter. So those are, in those times, it's probably in your best interest to outline exactly who your members are. But I think this point is just to stress that those elements can change and can be renegotiated after the fact, but not the actual deliverables and the scope itself. I hope that kind of answers that question. Perfect. So I'll move on a little bit to what a sample RFP form looks like. For those of you who are here in the past, this may look very familiar to you. The RFP template or the form itself looks very similar to all of our other solicitations on our e-procurement platform. In it, you'll see this is kind of the cover page. It has all of the key information, including the project title, the project number, as well as the key dates down at the bottom here. Just like an IFB or an RFQ process, you do want to keep in mind the key dates down at the bottom of when the project is released, the questions deadline, and the bid submission or RFP submission deadline. As we discussed in the last week's IFB process, if you have any questions about the RFP itself, the scope, anything that seems unclear from the language in the scope, or details about the specification, please ask during the questions deadline. Anything submitted prior to the deadline, we typically will answer in the form of an addenda or as part of the project's Q&A section itself. And anything after the deadline, we typically cannot answer unless it's something simple in regards to the process itself. We may still choose to answer some additional questions submitted after the deadline, but typically no, unless it's very pertinent to the project at hand. And another reason is the timelines are typically structured in such a way as to give the city enough time to get pertinent questions answered by subject matter experts and sent back out to the public so that everyone can have a chance to review and then submit something substantive. Questions will be answered at a minimum of 48 hours prior to the proposal due date. So for something that is due on Thursday, for example, you'll likely see the questions and answers at the very latest by Tuesday morning. We try to give as much time as possible for any kind of questions to be responded to, and then for any potential bidders to look at them so that they can evaluate their own proposal and submit something that they're happy with. Other than that, all of the regular timelines apply. So just like an IFB, we have to advertise RFPs for a minimum of 2 weeks. Though typically we try to give more time because RFPs are more complicated and they typically take more time on the vendor side to kind of review, to come up with a more detailed proposal. So I think as a standard, our RFP processes take more than 3 weeks. We try to give that window of time so that proposers can submit something that they're happy with. And then the due date will be 3 weeks following the first initial advertisement. So how do I respond to an RFP? So like all the other solicitations that the city puts out, please review the RFP document. And it'll have the key dates, and it'll have any pre-bid meetings that will address some of the questions that may come up. Pay attention to what is being asked or required, whether it's a good, a service, and ask questions. Anything that's unclear, sorry, another question coming. I will take that in a moment. Anything that is unclear or uncertain, feel free to pose those as a question in our questions and answers section. The key thing dealing with RFPs is ensure your response directly addresses each requirement specified in the RFP. That is both quality requirements as well as the comparative criterion. The comparative criterion are directly laid out in the RFP document itself, so they serve as a rubric for how your proposal will be graded. Because of that, it's very easy to structure your proposal in such a way that it addresses each of the criterion so that they can be easily identified, and the committee that is reviewing those proposals can grade those on a one-by-one basis. That's going to be your best way to succeed when submitting a proposal, as you hit each of those categories one by one. And be aware of the submission deadlines and the submission requirements as they're laid out. Just like in the IFB section, each one will be laid out in the vendor submission section. If there's documents that need to be uploaded, they'll be identified clearly, as well as in the scope itself. The key thing with an RFP is do not mention price in your technical section. Price remains sealed, and there will be a section separate for the submission of price proposals, but that must remain separate and confidential until the non-price section, the technical section, is fully evaluated. So I'm going to go through a couple of these questions. Hold on. The first question is asking for me to share my email, I believe. I did get your email. I have not had a chance to respond to it yet. I will try to get to that as quickly as possible. The second question is, how do you handle the evaluation price for architectural engineering services? So architectural and engineering services are a little different than the typical RFP process. So we are dealing with an RFP. So let me phrase that in two ways. The city does have several architectural engineering contracts. They are solicited periodically. I unfortunately don't know when the next iteration of those are going out, but they'll be going through kind of a similar but different process to what we're discussing here, which is for goods and services. Now, we do solicit some additional consultant services that may fall under that architectural engineering umbrella through the RFP process. And I'm guessing that I may be able to speak a little more to. Just like when we do that, in that case, if it's not through one of our house doctor solicitations, it'll follow the typical RFP process. We'll do the kind of two elements separately, the technical and then the price proposal. I guess I'll say if there's interest in kind of doing a different dive into the construction side of things, we can take that into consideration and see if that's maybe of interest to folks. The architectural engineering services falls onto our construction side of the work. It follows a like I said, kind of a slightly different process than our typical RFPs. There are definitely similarities between them, but the way the city's architectural and engineering contracts work is we solicit a number of different architectural firms once every 3 years or so, and they stay on contract as house doctors that we then go to for smaller projects. Does that somewhat answer the question? I know it doesn't kind of address the whole process, but. Okay, moving on a little bit. Perfect. So the price proposal form of an RFP will take a number of different forms. It can be as simple as what you've seen in the past from our invitation for bid solicitations. When there is a simple kind of mathematical formula for unit pricing and a number of units, it can take that simple table form and may appear in our solicitation as just a simple table. Alternatively, I've taken an example from a relatively recent RFP that is a little more complicated. And the proposal here is taking in not only information about individual pricing for affordable housing units, as well as development addresses, total units, installation costs, et cetera, in which case we might use a separate Excel table, or some other web form-based pricing table. In either case, when you're submitting the pricing tables as a attachment to the proposal itself or through the electronic table built into the e-procurement system, there is a built-in mechanic that it keeps it all separate and sealed until we unseal that element of the process. When we did this in paper form, and I expect other municipalities may still, you'll be asked to submit both of these sections separately. So you'll submit two separate envelopes, one with the technical aspects of whatever proposal it is, plus one pricing proposal, which may just be a few pages with all of the dollar amounts, the unit costs, etc. And then the pricing costs themselves are sealed until the full evaluation of the technical aspects take place. Whatever process that is followed, whoever it is that is doing the process must ensure that the pricing tables themselves remain sealed until such time as the technical evaluations are complete. And the technical evaluations are done by a committee of members, typically an odd number, so that there is no kind of tie that evaluate the proposal as subject matter experts. We typically see a committee made up of 3 to 5 different members, usually of city staff, sometimes with outside assistance. And they kind of go through each proposal's technical submission one by one and give them a rating based on all of the outlined comparative criteria. Once we in the purchasing department gathers all of those submittals, all of those evaluations, and determine which one is rated highest, we then open the pricing proposals themselves and then kind of go through them one by one. This way, the technical proposals are always evaluated in a price blind process, so that the price itself shouldn't dictate whether or not your good or service is offering you the best value. And that, in a nutshell, is kind of the RFP process. I want to pause here to see if there's any questions about any aspect of that process or anything else that has come up so far. Okay, it doesn't look like there is any, so I'll speak a little bit about when we might use RFPs. So once again, this,
we do
sorry.
Have
okay, sure.
Yes.
Hi, thank you. I'm wondering if what kind of feedback do we receive as the vendors if we submit all the paperwork, but still we don't get the job.
Perfect. Yeah. So the question was what kind of feedback the vendor may receive at the end of the process. So we always publish both the bid tabulation data. Basically, that is the pricing data for an RFP process that actually does not appear publicly until the end of the process. So when a proposal deadline is hit, when you go to a bid tab sheet, for example, you may just see who submitted. So that's the initial data that gets released. Now, the actual evaluation itself can take anywhere between as short as a week to maybe 2 to 3 weeks, depending on how many proposals there are submitted, as well as the schedules of the evaluation committees themselves and whether or not there's an interview process involved. So all of those could complicate and lengthen the time. But the end of the evaluation process typically comes with a contract award, in which case we will then update the tab sheet to reflect who the contract is awarded to, plus the dollar amounts, because at that point, the entirety of the process is fully public. We don't typically send out rejection letters individually to all of those that are not awarded the proposal, but all of the evaluation score sheets by the committee members, plus their rankings are public records. So if you're interested in seeing, for example, how your firm did in comparison with other proposals that were submitted, you can just reach out and request those score sheets, basically, and see how you were scored on which criteria and how the other firms did in comparison to you. In fact, we see that quite often with most of our RFP processes. Most of those firms then reach out and just kind of check back in to see where they were scored, how they could have done better to prepare kind of for the next iteration of either this process or something else they're working on.
A question that came in, Shu, was, are there any mandatory submittal requirements?
Yeah, so this is a little dependent on the project in question. Just like an IFB, there are typically some mandatory requirements that must be submitted. Most situations, there will be, at the very minimum, those same forms that we showed last time. So there's the query form, there's the wage theft prevention form, the WISP affirmation. All of those forms are also in the RFP process. They share all those baseline items. Depending on what the RFP is for, there are typically other submission requirements that are laid out in the scope. So we may ask for, in the consultation example previously, a list of consultants or staff members dedicated to the task. Or for a product, for example, let's say we were soliciting a software. We may ask for detailed product specifications that are outside of what the scope offers. It may be safety data sheets for those of you in the products service, for example. It may be past work experience in the form of other consultant like reports that they've done. So it can vary, I guess, is the long and short answer of it. Basically, depending on what the actual RFP is. The baseline you should always expect from the City of Cambridge, at least, is all of those forms, the sample contract, and maybe one or two other items.
Any other questions regarding the workshop that we're currently talking about, or just procurement questions in general? Please feel free to ask.
So if there's not, I do want to spend a few minutes on something that is that we also use as procurement vehicles. So we've kind of spent the last 3 sessions for this webinar series to talking about all of the typical processes that the city and most other cities and towns follow when procuring goods and services. Week 1, we kind of discussed the under $10,000 threshold, sound business practices. Week 2, we discussed the RFQ process, the IFB process, which are, I think, the bulk of what we do. So our spending by contract typically falls into both of those process ranges. In week 3, this is the most complicated process that we have available to us for most of our procurements, which is the RFP process, and allows us to do a more evaluative award. Now, obviously, this doesn't cover the full breadth of all of the city's procurements. So I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about other methods that the city procures goods and services. So there's a number of other procurement vehicles that the city regularly uses, and these are available to other towns and cities as well as certain nonprofits. And some of you in the chat may actually be familiar with a few of these, if not all of them. The first of which is the state contracts. They're offered by the OSD, so Operational Services Division of the Massachusetts State Legislature. The contracts themselves are solicited through the state, and they can be used by most towns, cities, nonprofits as a kind of bypass to the regular procurements that we need to do. Because all of the contractors on these contracts have been pre-procured. They've already gone through a robust and rigid procurement process. We typically can go through the contracts themselves to procure any of the services needed without having to do any of these previous noted processes. Meaning that we can, for example, go to a office supplies vendor through the office supplies contract and go direct to them without having to do a bid, even though it may be over $50,000. Oh, excuse me. These contracts are all managed by a number of state contract managers. And I believe currently they are by contract categories. So there's a number of categories out there on the state contract user guides dealing with everything from your regular office supplies to vehicles, vehicle parts, some services, some consultant services, some tradesperson services even. And each state contract has their own restrictions, has their own guidelines for usage. So we always abide by those. And for the most part, they are procured every few years periodically. That you may see a solicitation go out from the state for any one of those contracts as they come up for renewal. For a lot of the day-to-day purchases, the city, as well as most other cities and towns in Massachusetts, I think make frequent usage of the statewide contracts, mainly because they already abide by Chapter 30B, which is our governing procurement laws, and they've already been pre-procured, so we know we're already getting competitive pricing for them. And they are an easily accessible vendor pool that already are familiar with dealing with the cities, with nonprofit organizations. I think I would suggest, if anyone's interested in just taking a look at the OSD website, just browsing through those available state contracts, kind of looking at when they next come up for expiration, and getting on them is a very easily accessible way to get much more reach throughout the state itself. The second kind of contract category I kind of want to discuss is department contracts. This, similar in line with the OSD contracts, is through the state. But unlike the OSD contracts, which are well published and available to everyone, these are contracts negotiated by state agencies. So this may be Department of Transportation of Massachusetts, or this may be the MWRA, who have negotiated smaller contracts themselves that we are allowed to piggyback on. For the most part, these aren't really published, and you kind of have to dig to find them. But if the state agency has an available contract with a vendor, with their permission, where we can piggyback off of those contracts and go direct to the vendor as well. So we don't see this very often at all. And I would say maybe we do this once a year at most, twice perhaps. A third category, broad category of available purchasing option are collective purchases. This is when one town, in collaboration with other towns, one or more other towns, may go out and solicit bids for goods and services for the whole group. We are a part of a number of different collectives, and you can imagine that the nearby towns typically band together for those goods or services that are commonly used between them to get better pricing, to get better contract coordination, especially for items that may be shared between departments of neighboring cities. Just as an example, we are in a collective for fuel, for gasoline, for diesel fuel, biodiesel, as well as salt. And in all ways and forms, this functions just like a regular invitation for bid would, except that one town takes the lead. So you may see the solicitation be put out by the city of Cambridge, by the city of Newton, whoever it may be. And in the solicitation, it will say, this is on behalf of town X, city X, or this whole group. Typically at the end result is each town then executes their own contract with whoever the awarded vendors are. That vendor then kind of individually executes contracts with each of the member parties of that collective. And lastly, cooperative contracts. Functionally, these are similar to statewide contracts in that they are negotiated by a entity, by a group, and they're open to all members of that group. I've posted a couple on here that some may be familiar with. These are big, some of these are big national aggregates like Sourcewell, Omnia. MHEC is a more local group, the Massachusetts Higher Education Consortium. And the city of Cambridge is a member of all three, and we can use those contracts. And these cooperative contracts function, like I said, just like the statewide contracts, in that they have been pre-negotiated, pre-contracted, and have gone through a robust procurement method already. Typically, we then are allowed to go direct to the vendors that have been awarded those contracts as a way to speed things along, especially for those often used goods or services. Like the state contracts, they each have their own limitations and their instructions. So you always make sure we are abiding by the rules of that contract. But unlike the state contract, we are not allowed to purchase services through any of the cooperative contracts. That's kind of the key difference between normal statewide and other cooperative contracts. And these four are kind of a big catch-all category for other purchasing options available for the city of Cambridge, as well as other towns and cities, and that we frequently use. If you're interested in any of them, each of them will have their own kind of different rules, regulations, and when they are up for expiration or renewal. Best thing to do if you're interested in one is look up kind of your service group, your category, and see when that contract under that cooperative or state contract is up for expiration. And then you can kind of get some idea of when you might need to be on the lookout for that solicitation. Any questions about any of these?
There doesn't seem to be any questions. Does anyone have any other questions for Shu? Oh, yeah, actually, we got one coming in right now. It says, as a small company, how can I pair with big contractors to get some part of a collective purchase of the collective purchases?
There's kind of two elements. Okay, so in the second question is what were collective purchase? So I'll kind of address those together. Collective purchases are, of the four categories listed here, when two or more cities or towns get together to solicit bids together. So you may see, for example, the city of Cambridge plus the city of Somerville in one solicitation and put out by one of those towns on behalf of the group. So that is answering that second question. The first question, as a small company, of how can I pair with big contracts to get some part of collective purchases? That has I guess I'll speak to statewide contracts because I think this is where perhaps I see the most option for this. State contracts have recently, maybe even not that recently, in the past few years certainly have had subcontracting goals for MWBEs specifically, but also for other groups, in which when there are cases of subcontracting needs, they kind of list the goals of each of the main contractors. In terms of how you can pair with big contracts to get some part of the larger contracts, I guess, I'm thinking this is probably more related to construction and construction-related contracts in which the city may put out a large construction project with a lot of subcontractors. If that is that kind of the question?
So I'm a small landscaping company, right?
Mhm.
And are these assume that I don't know what kind of contracts that different towns or cities kind of get collective and purchase, like probably if it's a big installation, per se, a pork, new pork installation, and that is that something that we can help, per se. If it's gonna be a long installation, can we get that long installation under our wing? Or can we put the trees in that kind of a small part of the contract? Is that how can we connect it to those big contracts? Because I don't think I will be able to kind of bid on a huge contract.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that depends a little bit on how the contract is structured, I think. You may see smaller contracts for in your example, a small plot of land for maintenance needs, for example, or landscaping needs. Or you may see a general citywide, like larger contract that you may not bid on, may not have the capacity to bid on. So that's kind of goes back to a little bit about the capacity building, capacity in our IFB and RFQ processes. In terms of subcontracting, which I think is where this is touching, some contracts allow for subcontracting. Typically, most of our contracts are direct to one bidder or one vendor. In construction field, which is where landscaping, installation, those things take place, our big contracts will have subcontract awards for each of the trades and jobs that are needed for a project. So you may see a large contract for multi-million-dollar contract with a subcontract award for an individual piece of that, dealing with plumbing or tiling or whatever it is, for $20,000, $30,000. And those are, again, part of our construction bidding rules, which I won't go into depth here, but they will also be bid out as another phase in the bidding process there. In terms of getting those like smaller contracts for, let's say, a small piece of landscaping needs or maintenance or installation for a smaller city building, whatever it may be, they'll be handled basically through the processes that we covered. So for typical landscaping maintenance, it might be a request for a quote solicitation that goes out to a number of vendors if it's between that $10,000 to $50,000 range.
Should we have another question here? Which of these is the collective contract for higher education?
Sure. So that's the MPEC noted here. Let me just type that in. The MPEC is the Massachusetts Higher Education Consortium. And they have a number of contracts available through them for basically mostly education needs, but also furniture and a number of other contracts available. MPEC is a little different from the other two in that it is more Massachusetts specific, so they are already in compliance with Chapter 30B. But like the other two, we really can't go to them for construction needs or services, but they have a number of contracts available under them. Definitely worth taking a quick look to see what might be on there and what you may be eligible for next time it goes out to bid.
If any other questions from folks, either regarding tonight's workshop or just previous two workshops, or just procurement questions in general, while we have Shu with us in a little bit more time, please feel free to either put them in the chat, Q&A, or you can raise your hand. I can unmute you so you can ask the question. Shoot, it seems like most folks are good and no more questions are coming in, so I don't know if you have any last thoughts or comments you want to share with folks just regarding this whole entire process, and also just encouraging folks, if you already haven't registered to become a vendor with the city, please make sure to do so on the city's e-procurement website, so that way you can be considered a vendor with the city. By filling out, all you need is the email address and uploading your W-9. So if you already haven't done so, please make sure to do that. And we do have a question actually coming in. What type of projects are subject to MBE/DBE goals?
Again, an element of our construction contracts. We do have those kind of those goals set in our construction contracting process. It sounds like there's actually a lot of interest in that side of city procurements, which if I were to leave folks with anything, if there's enough interest, maybe that's baseline for another like webinar dealing purely with our construction side of things. I will say the construction processes governed by 3039M and 149A are very different from the goods and services side of things we've covered thus far. And while they share plenty of similarities, the rules and the differences there are worth taking a look at. So if there's interest, we can kind of think about doing a separate webinar for those elements.
A question came in the Q&A. Does MHEC have a relationship with the SDO?
No, not any direct relationship, I think is the answer. I think certainly SDO is familiar with MHEC and they share some information. Obviously, I can't speak to either party, but there's no kind of direct relationship with the two.
Another question. I think my company is registered with the city of Cambridge. How do I make sure I'm registered and where to check?
So if you are if you have a login through OpenGov, which it sounds like you do, all you have to do is just check to see if you have the city of Cambridge followed. I think the easiest way to do that is to go to our e-procurement site and see if that image, that city of Cambridge link has a follow on it. If not, you can click it, you'll be following it directly right after that.
Any other questions? Sure. So yeah, Shu, I don't know if you have any final words before we kind of wrap up here.
I hope that this was at least somewhat informative to folks. Our intent with this series is to try to at least break down some of the confusion regarding city and contracting. Certainly, we understand that there's a lot of small businesses we're interested in doing business with the city, and you may not be able to make use of all of the elements throughout the 3 webinars that we've done, but hopefully this will at least give you a little insight on kind of both the restrictions that we're under as well as the kind of processes that we typically do on a day-to-day basis. Certainly, if there's interest, we're happy to do additional follow-ups for any element that may be confusing or unclear. We're always looking to connect more with our vendor pool and try to expand that.
Another question came in right here, following up on the MHEC question. If I am on a statewide contract with the SDO, is there a reciprocal relationship with MHEC?
Not to my knowledge. So the statewide contract is issued through the SDO, and the MHEC has, to my knowledge, no real direct connection to the state government. They're kind of their standalone entity. Though I think if you had to choose one or the other, if you're on the statewide contract, that is certainly the more robust one to be available through. Most cities and towns will be using that as a primary go-to if there's in need of something that they can go to direct. In fact, a lot of smaller towns and cities with perhaps a smaller procurement department will almost exclusively make use of those kinds of contracts.
Any last questions? Please feel free. Glad to hear that it was useful. So if we don't have any more questions, firstly, we just want to thank everyone for taking the time to attend tonight. I will be emailing this presentation out to everyone who's attended, so please be on the lookout for that, as well as for all of you who attended tonight or either of the previous two workshops, a post-workshop survey, just about your thoughts and opinions on how this workshop was the information useful? Folks just typed in the chat that they found it useful, but your feedback will be much appreciated, just so we can continue to figure out how we can best support small businesses. Some of the questions might be, is there any information that we might have not covered that you're still interested in learning about? And as Shu mentioned, we might think about doing other workshops around construction and stuff like that, those are things that we might do moving forward for people who may be interested in that. But we just want to thank you all for taking your time to join us for these 3 workshops. Please feel free, if you do have any follow-up questions, to reach out to me, and I would be happy to either try and answer them or send those questions to Shu and Liz so they can answer them. And we just thank Shu for taking his time, as well as Liz for the previous 2 workshops to facilitate this and help give you guys some information about how to do business with the city of Cambridge. So on that note, Shu, thank you very much, and thank you everyone for attending. And we hope to see you all soon. Have a great evening.
Thank you.